Hey guys, tonight we travel into a supremely odd corner of Victorian history, where vast green hills roll under a sky so gray it might as well have been drawn with a dull pencil, and a chilly breeze sets countless fleecy bodies wobbling over the pastures. You're stepping right into a moment when Britain, in its unstoppable zeal for order and empire, decided to count, yes, literally count every single sheep across its many counties. You can almost hear the gentle rustle of paper ledgers, the faint squeak of quill pens, and the bleating chorus echoing through the valleys as an entire nation sets out to inventory its woolly population. It's a bit like trying to count bubbles in a hot bath, except these bubbles move, complain, and occasionally run straight into hedges. You probably won't survive the boredom. I mean, not the sheep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward on a narrow track between hedgerows, the damp soil, clinging to your boots with every patient step. The year is somewhere around 1865, though no one seems to pin it down precisely, since official records were surprisingly scattershot even in the Victorian age. You catch sight of a group of government-appointed enumerators, men in stovepipe hats, and practical wool coats balancing battered leather satchels stuffed with thick paper forms. They look like a traveling swarm of bureaucratic honeybees determined to sip up every possible drop of data about the country's sheep. This, you learn, is the Great Sheep Census, a massive countrywide attempt to account for every ram, ewe, and lamb munching its way through Great Britain's pastures. It feels like a completely bonkers idea, and you wouldn't be alone in thinking that. Even then, shepherds scratched their heads and whispered suspicions over their mugs of weak ale. Why on earth would the government count sheep? Was it about taxes, wool price manipulation? Simple curiosity. Historians still argue whether the census was really an agricultural census for the public good or a thinly disguised way to squeeze rural profits for empire building. You pause to watch as one enumerator carefully interviews a surly farmer with weather-beaten cheeks. A couple of sheepdogs dance circles around their flock, no doubt wondering if these two-legged interlopers might try to steal the herd. The farmer insists he's got exactly 137 sheep, no more, no less, but you can see the enumerator's skeptical eyebrow rise as he marks down the number with a blotchy pen. And if you look close enough, there's a faint grin tugging at the farmer's lips, like he might just have hidden a few woolly charges behind the old stone wall. Everywhere the air holds a low chorus of bleats, a soundtrack to Victorian ambition and anxiety. Industrial Britain was rolling ahead, at full steam quite literally, with factories cranking out wool cloth from Yorkshire to Lancashire. Wool exports were vital, and so the bright minds of the empire figured, we should know exactly how many sheep feed our looms. It sounds reasonable until you realize there are millions upon millions of sheep, and only a few hundred census officers with questionable math skills, fogged-up spectacles, and boots that sink hopelessly in the moors. One man you pass a census supervisor carries a battered canvas bag overflowing with quills, extra ink pots, and a small wedge of bread stuffed with cold roast beef. He's trudging toward the next parish, already behind schedule. A bit of a joke emerges as he stumbles on a rut in the path, cursing lightly before remembering to mind his language in front of a lady passing by. You can't help but imagine the villagers placing bets on which census man would collapse in the mud first. It's hard not to chuckle at the mental image dignified officials with starched collars slowly surrendering to sheep mud rain and the sheer absurdity of their own project. The census was supposed to last mere weeks, but stretched on for months in some regions, bogged down by missing sheep duplicate counts and the surprising cunning of rural shepherds. They say that one old drover in Dorset kept shifting his flock around the hills whenever census takers approached, confusing them so thoroughly that they recorded his 300 sheep 3 separate times. This story may be exaggerated, but it fits the spirit of a countryside unwilling to reveal all its secrets. In fact, some local elders insisted the census was an attempt to push them off their ancestral grazing rights altogether, even though the official decree claimed otherwise. Whether or not that was true, historians still debate, arguing over half-baked memos and contradictory letters buried in the archives. As you stand by a crumbling milestone, you catch the earthy scent of damp wool, hear the occasional squelch of a sheep hoof landing in marshy ground, and watch those fluffy bodies bunch and spread like an old patchwork blanket breathing in the wind. Your mind drifts, wondering how on earth someone could stand here all day and keep counting scribbling numbers as if they were grains of sand. But that was precisely what these census workers tried to do, believing that their lists would feed the empire's unstoppable appetite for growth. A nearby shepherd boy, barely 12, grins as he counts off his father's sheep, far faster than any suited census clerk. He rattles through the breeds, South Downs Cheviots, Leicesters, with a confidence born of everyday living. You can almost feel the chill settling on his ragged coat as a drizzle begins to tap gently on the bristly wool all around. Somewhere in the distance, the faint peal of a church bell reminds everyone that night is never far off in these parts, and that even the most ambitious census must eventually pause for a warm fire and a scrap of bread. And so you wander on, swept up in the ridiculous majesty of an empire, trying to count its fleecy riches, step after step, through mud mist and the warm, unmistakable smell of lanolin. The great sheep census had begun, and you, dear listener, are right in the thick of it. You step carefully over another muddy rut, the faint echo of boots behind you, blending with the soft drumming of sheep hooves across the moor. Ahead, a ragtag group of census men march grimly into the fog, led by a man whose entire job, apparently, is to carry a gigantic leather-bound register as wide as a breakfast tray. These officials, known half-mockingly as the Clipboard Battalion, have become a familiar sight in village lanes and wide, wind-hammered hills. They look serious, but then again it is very hard to look serious when a small white lamb tries to nibble your pencil as you write. The moors themselves feel endless under a pewter sky. Bristly heather scratches at your sleeves, and a faint breeze brings the sharp tang of wet peat. You can see census workers trying to count through the swirling mist, squinting at blobs of white that shift and bunch like foam on an angry sea. One enumerator waves you closer, clearly needing a second pair of eyes, as a dense knot of sheep suddenly explodes, scattering downhill in every direction. It is a bit like herding toddlers hopped up on sugar except woollier, and with more of a tendency to roll in dung. Paper forms flutter from the clerk's coat as he chases after the flock, barking a frustrated laugh. A second clerk scolds him for failing to tie the papers down with twine, a suggestion the first man pointedly ignores while mud seeps into the cuffs of his trousers. These were men who normally handled neat columns of trade statistics in stuffy London offices. Now they were ankle-deep in peat, having debates about whether that lamb had a black nose or a pink nose. Historians still argue whether this kind of fieldwork was truly necessary or just a half-baked public relations exercise to prove to Parliament that even remote farmers could be counted. Out here, the shepherds rule. They know every fold of the land, every winding sheep track, every place a panicked ewe might vanish. They also know how to charm or deflect the officials who come poking around. You watch one older shepherd leaning on his crook, claiming he'd lost count of his sheep entirely after a storm blew down half the hedges. But behind him, his dogs round up every last animal with mechanical precision, as if they'd been trained for years to play the perfect cover story. The census men sigh, mutter about honesty, and try to count anyway. Even the dogs get in on the farce. One census worker describes how a clever collie would dart in and out of sight, disrupting the count so completely that sheep got tallied twice or not at all. It became a running joke in the local taverns, where the farmers would raise pints and toast. His Majesty's dog tax convinced the whole census was a backdoor scheme to tax working animals, too. If you stand very still, you can practically hear the laughter echoing through the stone-walled tap rooms, mixed with the crackle of a peat fire. You follow the census men across a shallow stream, boots slipping on the mossy stones, a gust of wind stirring the edge of their tally sheets. One clerk makes a joke about inventing waterproof ink, which gets a polite chuckle, though you suspect he's serious. The entire process was endlessly wet, endlessly messy, and endlessly frustrating. A mainstream fact emerges here. Britain was the largest wool exporter in the world during the mid-19th century, fueling a booming textile industry that clothed half the empire. Knowing precisely how many sheep were out there mattered in theory, at least, to keep those industrial looms humming. Still counting living, breathing, opinionated sheep was a far cry from measuring bolts of cloth in a London warehouse. One fringe rumor floated among the officials, half-whispered, as they huddled over cold bread and cider. Somewhere in Wales, a local inventor had made a mechanical counting machine for sheep like a giant turnstile. No one ever proved it existed, but the idea fascinated the census crew who dreamed of a day they might tally from a warm office instead of slogging through the mud. Historians still argue if this rumor had any truth or was simply a myth, told to keep up their spirits. You watch as a supervisor, his coat draped over one shoulder, tries to keep calm while two lambs tumble through his legs, nearly knocking him flat. He steadies himself barely with a curse so mild you might hear it in a nursery rhyme, then reaches down to help an assistant retrieve a spilled ink pot from the grass. The scene feels absurdly peaceful, despite the chaos, the steady bleating, the soft rush of wind through the moorland grass, the earthy perfume of lanolin all mingling together. You catch a hint of the sea on that breeze, a reminder that beyond these hills lay ports ready to carry bales of wool as far as Australia and India. By the time the census men stop to rest, you're aching from the effort of keeping pace. They flop down under a stunted oak, ink-stained fingers, trembling as they pass around a wedge of cold, lardy pie. One enumerator sighs and wonders out loud if anyone will actually read the figures they so painstakingly record. You sense the doubt in their voices, the hint that this census might be more performance than science, a kind of national ritual. Yet they press on day after day, convinced the data will matter. Night begins to descend over the moor, a soft gray veil settling over stone walls and distant sheepfolds. Lanterns flicker on one by one across scattered cottages, while the census team packs up their ledgers for tomorrow's count. You, too, feel the weight of evening, that gentle hush that comes when even the sheep begin to settle down. And in that hush, you realize you're part of something deeply, almost hilariously human, the need to measure, to count, to make sense of a world that rarely makes sense at all. You wake with a chill in your bones, dawn just brushing the horizon, as the soft chorus of bleats rises once again across the fields. Another day means another fresh wave of counting, and you trail behind the census men as they head toward yet another flock on the next patch of moor. The path is rough, puddled with rain from the night before, and you step carefully to avoid slipping on sheep droppings that dot the road like confetti after a very rustic parade. Ahead, a group of shepherds waits, eyeing the clipboard-wielding visitors with no small amount of suspicion. These were the guardians of their flocks, after all living lives, measured by lambing seasons, by wool fairs, by the steady rhythm of the dog's bark and the clatter of hooves. You see in their eyes a question one they don't even need to speak. What business does London have poking its nose into their sheep? The head enumerator, a thin fellow with a nervous cough, tries to reassure them. No taxes, he repeats for perhaps the 100th time, purely account for the good of the nation. Of course, you can sense the skepticism rolling off the shepherds like morning fog. Some grin and nod politely, but you catch a knowing glance between two brothers leaning on their crooks. They're not buying it for a second. Historians still argue whether the census really was free of financial motives, or if a hidden tax agenda lurked beneath its tidy ledgers. As the officials begin their tally, the shepherds help round up the sheep. A half-dozen collies dart back and forth, working like clockwork, to gather stragglers, their eyes bright with purpose. You can't help but admire these dogs, so quick, so clever, that they almost seem to read the sheep's minds. Meanwhile, the enumerators fumble with their quill pens, trying to list each breed correctly, each tag number, each wool estimate, all while being jostled by restless animals. One mainstream historical fact slips into your thoughts here. Victorian Britain, at the height of the Industrial Revolution, was devouring wool to feed its global textile empire. There were millions upon millions of sheep grazing the land, their fleece headed toward the booming looms of Yorkshire and Lancashire. No wonder the government had decided to count them. Yet the process feels comically futile as you watch a lamb escape the group entirely, leaping a stone wall in a single, graceful bound, leaving the enumerator squinting in total confusion. A fringe rumor bubbles up from a passing shepherd. Someone in Yorkshire had tried to dye sheep bright blue to keep them from blending in with the landscape and being missed in the count. Whether that was ever more than a tavern yarn, no one could say, but you're charmed by the mental picture of a whole field of blueberry-colored sheep bleating their protests. And in truth, it might have made counting easier. Historians still argue about whether these dye experiments were real or just jokes to wind up the census men. As the morning wears on, you witness an exchange that sums up the entire census perfectly. A farmer declares quite earnestly that he owns 47.5 sheep. The enumerator, naturally, is puzzled. The farmer then gestures to a lamb with a missing leg. That's the half, he says deadpan. You see the census man's jaw drop, and for a moment you might swear even the dogs are laughing. The enumerators continue wrestling with ledgers and inkpots while trying to stay upright on the shifting, uneven pasture. Their boots sink deeper into the boggy turf every time they pause to scribble another note. You can almost feel the weight of soggy wool against your legs as a damp breeze carries the strong, unmistakable tang of lanolin. All around you the sheep shuffle and nudge each other with a kind of ancient familiarity, their eyes placid, their bellies content. Beyond the field you glimpse low stone cottages with smoke curling lazily from the chimneys. Here life remains pinned to the rhythms of the land, its people suspicious of distant authorities but fiercely loyal to their animals and neighbors. In a nearby hedgerow, a magpie flits in and out, watching the human commotion with what looks like amused contempt. You wander along, observing it all, letting the rhythm of the sheep and the bleats lull you into a kind of waking trance. There is a gentle absurdity in trying to measure nature with the same zeal used to measure steam engines and cotton cloth. Yet here they are, quill in hand, determined to number every fleecy head. One enumerator slips on a clump of moss, nearly face-planting in front of a group of young shepherd boys who immediately break into giggles. The man recovers with a flustered bow pretending dignity, but you see the blush creeping up his cheeks. A moment later, a lamb decides to sample the edge of his wool coat, adding one more insult to an already bruised ego. By noon, the counting crew is ready for a break. They gather under a crooked hawthorn tree, splitting a wedge of heavy bread with pickled onions, while the sheep mill around them with mild curiosity. The conversation drifts between numbers, weather, and dreams of warm fires back in town. You can sense a faint weariness in their voices, and maybe even a touch of wonder at the endless sea of white wool before them. As you lean against the tree trunk, a sense of gentle calm begins to sink in. You hear the wind threading through the grasses, the distant hush of a stream, the occasional baa punctuating the quiet. And once more you're reminded that this whole census, grand and silly as it might seem, is also a portrait of the stubborn, hopeful nature of people who want to know their world, even if that means chasing after sheep who never wanted to be known at all. The sun, a watery coin behind shifting clouds, begins to climb a little higher as you push on with the census men through another rolling meadow. Each step squishes softly into the peat, carrying you closer to the heart of the sheep-counting mission. You spot a weather-stained milestone with faint lettering, a reminder of just how far these officials have traveled in their obsessive quest. All roads, it seems, led back to wool and to the Empire's constant hunger for it. The talk today among the enumerators shifts to trade. You overhear them debating whether the price of raw wool will rise with all these numbers, pinned down in careful columns. They argue in low voices, their breath puffing into the chilly morning air. Britain, they remind each other, is nothing without its wool. Entire textile cities depend on the fleece carried from these very hills. A mainstream fact dances through your mind. By the mid-1800s, Britain dominated world wool exports, spinning local sheep into an empire clothing machine that reached every continent. Yet one can't help but notice that the sheep themselves seem utterly uninterested in empire or global trade or the ambitions of men. They simply want to graze in peace no matter who shows up with a quill. You watch a lamb nose at a census man's bootlaces, determined to chew them, while the clerk tries in vain to shake it off. It is a gentle reminder that nature, in all its soft, bleeding glory, pays no heed to official ledgers. As you cross a narrow stile, you catch the scent of roasting barley from a farmhouse in the distance, mingled with the earthy perfume of lanolin from the sheep. A shepherd greets the census men leaning on a crook, polished smooth by decades of use. His coat is thick and patched, and the lines of his face read like a topographical map of wind, sun, and time. He stands ready to defend his flock's privacy, answering questions only when absolutely cornered. You hear him say, with a twinkle of mischief, that his sheep cannot be counted because they are free citizens. Historians still argue whether these local jokes concealed a more serious pushback against government intrusion. One enumerator attempts a bit of humor, offering to count the sheep in a democratic fashion. That gets a sharp chuckle from the shepherd, who reminds him the sheep don't vote, no matter how many you try to register. You catch the flash of a grin between the dogs as they swirl behind the flock, as if even they know how hopeless this whole endeavor feels. The conversation drifts toward empire once again. Some believe that if wool exports faltered, Britain's might would follow. It seems hard to imagine so much power riding on the back of so many fleecy animals, but that is exactly how the numbers stacked up in Victorian times. The census men grow solemn, perhaps wondering if their columns of figures can really capture so vast a story. By mid-morning, you arrive at a windswept ridge where the sheep huddle in great lumps like living snowdrifts. The enumerators must now decide how to count them. One man proposes tallying from a distance to avoid stirring them up, while another argues they must inspect each tag directly. A mild squabble erupts. One clerk nearly jabs the other with a quill by accident, spattering a drop of ink onto his own nose. A small moment of hilarity breaking the grim seriousness of empire. Meanwhile, a fringe tidbit tickles your memory. Rumor had it that some landowners tried to bribe census officials to underreport their sheep numbers, fearing fresh taxes, or worse, the loss of grazing rights. Whether this was a widespread practice or a tall tale, historians still argue, picking through letters written in cryptic phrases no modern official could fully decode. The ridge provides a breathtaking view, miles of rolling green, dotted with white flecks, framed by dry stone walls that zigzag like sleepy snakes. From here, you can almost sense the rhythm of the land, each field marked by centuries of quiet, grazing births and hard winters. The census, in all its clumsy detail, was trying to stitch this immense patchwork into something legible, something Parliament could hold in its hands. As you pause on the ridge, the wind tugs at your sleeves, and the bleating of the sheep rolls across the open air like the sound of a distant sea. The dogs keep moving, weaving the flock into a tighter knot, while the clerks scribble down fresh counts, blotting the pages with their cold, unsteady fingers. They are determined in their paper-pushing way to bring order to a world that always wriggles away. Further down the ridge, a pair of small boys drive their family's sheep toward a stone pen, helping their father, who is busy arguing numbers with the census team. You notice their faces bright with mischief as they swap sheep in and out of the pen when no one is looking. Maybe you think it was a kind of rural sport, outwit. The officials keep them guessing, protect the family's livelihood from what felt like an intrusive hand. As the sun climbs, you sense the day beginning to warm, though the breeze stays cool. The men remove their hats, wiping sweat from their brows as they try to keep their ledgers straight. Even the sheep appear to doze their broad flanks, rising and falling in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It is easy in that moment to let your mind drift to imagine you are counting dreams instead of sheep, tallying hopes instead of wool. One official accidentally spills a bit of ink on a lamb's back, creating a blue splotch that makes the animal look briefly like an exotic foreign breed. The shepherd laughs until tears stream down his weathered face. For a moment, even the officials join in their shared frustration, dissolving into harmless laughter, carried away by the wind. You stand there breathing in the quiet and realize the great sheep census was never just about numbers. It was about the strange way people try to understand their world, about the stubborn, sometimes silly dance between nature and rule books, between empire and the earth. And as you shoulder your pack to follow the team down the slope, you feel that gentle, mocking sense of wonder once again. You drift along a winding lane, the scent of crushed nettles mixing with damp earth as you trail the census men deeper into another green valley. Their footsteps drum a patient rhythm through the mud boots caked in clay and dreams of order. You notice how they carry their precious ledgers like priests guarding a holy book. Though these volumes list not souls, but sheep, millions of them in fact, each woolly life committed to ink in the hope of grasping Britain's wealth. The rain begins again, a thin, steady drizzle that drips off your hat brim, catching on your eyelashes, in a way that feels almost personal. The clerks curse under their breath as water smudges their ledgers, sending letters bleeding into uncertain loops. They pause under the awning of a small barn. To dry the pages, a hopeless task, really, since the wool all around seems to act like a sponge for the rain. One enumerator sighs and mutters something about carbon paper, a miracle yet to be invented, while another digs for a fresh quill, its feather limp from damp. You catch the occasional nervous laugh as they share stories of how many times they have rewritten a single parish's numbers after discovering that sheep had gone missing, been born, or simply wandered off again. Historians still argue whether any of these lists were even halfway accurate. Inside the barn, you catch the comforting smell of straw and warm animal breath. A pair of sheep huddle in a corner, chewing methodically as if nothing at all could rattle them. You let your gaze wander over the coarse wooden beams, the rusted lanterns swinging gently from the rafters. It feels timeless in here, like you could close your eyes and wake up in any century, still hearing the same steady clatter of hooves and the endless complaints of men with pens. Beyond the barn, the conversation turns to wool's power. Victorian investors gambled enormous fortunes on wool prices, speculating as eagerly as modern stockbrokers on social media. One mainstream fact you might appreciate: by the 1860s, wool made up one of Britain's top 3 export commodities alongside coal and iron. The empire quite literally clothed itself and half the known world on the backs of these sheep. Meanwhile, the enumerators squabble about a rumor they've heard. One clerk insists there was a royal fleece owned by a distant Scottish laird, supposedly so fine it was reserved for the Queen's undergarments. Another calls that nonsense, claiming it was just a marketing tale, dreamed up to impress buyers at the great London wool auctions. Historians still argue whether such a fleece ever existed, and the debate passes between the men like a warm flask on a cold morning. You slip back outside with them following as they resume their trudge across the meadows. Rain turns the sheep's wool into sagging lumps that look oddly like wet sponges, and the officials squint through the mist, struggling to tell one animal from another. A lamb breaks from the group, racing in circles around a startled collie who nearly topples an enumerator trying to count. The whole group erupts in a chorus of half laughter, half exasperation. At a small rise in the ground, the census supervisor, a man with an ink-smudged cravat and truly heroic eyebrows, tries to call the group to order. "Gentlemen, please," he says with grand exasperation, "we must strive for accuracy." But his voice is nearly drowned by a sudden gust of wind, sending tally sheets flapping out of a colleague's arms like startled pigeons. The papers spin through the air, landing in puddles across brambles, and even on the woolly backs of 3 very unimpressed ewes. The scene is so perfect you might laugh out loud. Even the sheep seem to smirk, as if they know full well they will never truly be tamed or numbered. You carry on, drawn by the strange music of the moors, a steady bleating, the ticking rain on your coat, the rustle of bracken underfoot. Sometimes the voices of the enumerators slip into gentle banter, comparing the comfort of various inns or arguing whether the bread pudding was better in Yorkshire or Devon. There's a homesick quality there, woven into the monotonous work of counting a need for small comforts to push away the cold. One clerk eyes bleary with lack of sleep jokes that he started dreaming of numbers at night like chasing sheep, but in arithmetic he sighs. You feel a surge of empathy, knowing that after days or weeks on the road, all those figures must blur into a single bleating echo in the mind. By late afternoon, you crest another low hill and catch a view of a distant market town, its spire reaching up through the drizzle like a hopeful flag. Their wool merchants wait to tally their own goods, trading bales at prices set halfway around the world. You think of how the census, slow and clumsy though it is, tries to feed those markets with a sense of stability, however illusory that might be. You sense the officials are relieved to see civilization again. A warm hearth, a proper mug of tea, a roof that doesn't leak. The sheep, of course, care nothing for roofs or ledgers. They nose through wet grass content to chew and wander as they always have. As the census men descend toward the town, you keep pace, mind drifting to the comforting rituals of hot supper and crackling fires. The evening bells begin to ring from the church tower, a low, soothing chime that blends with the soft murmurs of lambs settling down for the night. And once again you feel that drowsy pull at the edges of your mind, as if even history itself might pause for a nap among the drifting fleeces. You stir awake as a rooster crows somewhere beyond the hedgerows, the faint gray dawn sliding into the valley like spilled cream. The census men are already up stoking a meager fire, rubbing warmth back into their stiff fingers as they prepare to resume the woolly tally. Another day, another flock, or perhaps the same flock, recounted for the third time, thanks to yesterday's misadventures. You walk alongside them down a winding lane, past slate-roofed cottages, where a thin trail of chimney smoke curls up into the breeze. At a crossroads, the enumerators argue gently over a blot of ink on their ledger, debating whether they wrote 30 or 38 in a particularly smudged column. A lamb wanders up behind them, headbutts one of their boots, then prances away with a look of total innocence. The official sighs and begins rewriting the tally for the third time. Historians still argue whether these repeated recounts were deliberate confusion or honest mistakes born of terrible working conditions. You follow them into another wide meadow where the grass is damp and glittering from a light overnight frost. The sheep gather here in thick knots, moving as one organism at times, then exploding apart whenever a dog so much as flicks its ear. The enumerators shuffle into place, trying to create an orderly pen in the open field, a strategy doomed from the start. You can practically taste the damp wool on the air as you stand there, half lost in a sea of living blankets. One mainstream historical fact sticks in your mind: Victorian textile exports relied so heavily on reliable wool supplies that even a hint of disease among flocks could crash entire regional economies. That threat, the census men believed, made this monumental count essential. Yet you see the problem instantly. These sheep have minds of their own, and no number, no matter how carefully recorded, could ever keep them entirely still. The sheepdogs work tirelessly, each responding to a shepherd's whistle, sweeping and spinning around the edges of the herd. You watch them in awe, so sharp, so quick, so steady, while the census men try not to trip over their own boots. A fringed tidbit makes its way through your thoughts. There was once a rumor that census officials tried to teach dogs to count barking once for each sheep, but no proof ever turned up in the archives. Still, the idea makes you smile, picturing collies doing arithmetic under a gray English sky. Midway through the morning, disaster arrives. A farmer's gate gives way under the weight of jostling wool, sending a tidal wave of ewes flooding out into a neighboring orchard. Apples crash to the ground, and the orchard keeper, a short, red-faced man with a tendency to swear in creative poetry, comes running with a broom in one hand, trying to shoo the invaders back toward the field. A census man nearly faints on the spot, seeing his careful ledgers dissolve in one grand, bleeding exodus. They spend an hour coaxing, herding, pleading the enumerators, looking increasingly like drowned crows soaked to the skin, and more confused by the minute. You can't help but laugh softly, the way one might laugh at a school play gone horribly, hilariously wrong. The sheep, meanwhile, appear to have no regrets, chomping happily on the orchard grass and ignoring every scolding word thrown their way. Finally, with help from a half-dozen villagers and their dogs, the flock is pushed back across the lane. The enumerators restart their tally, though you suspect no one truly believes the count is accurate anymore. Historians still argue about the final published numbers of the Great Sheep Census, wondering if they reflected a genuine national snapshot or just a polite fantasy Parliament could swallow. Lunch is taken under an old oak tree leaves, rattling gently in the breeze. The men unwrap hard cheese hunks of cold pork and a loaf so stale it could have doubled as a weapon. You share the moment with them, breathing the earthy perfume of trampled grass and warm wool. For a heartbeat, the world seems to slow, and a gentle peace settles over the countryside. One enumerator recounts the tale of a Northumberland shepherd who once claimed he could count 400 sheep. By just smelling them, a party trick no one quite believed, but it made for excellent fireside boasting. Another clerk jokes that he might start dreaming of sheep's feet, since that's all he seems to see day after day. You smile because even in its absurdity, there's a strange kind of poetry to this routine. The afternoon drifts onward, the census team moving steadily across low stone walls over wooden stiles, past ditches and streams that catch the glint of a pale sun. Sheep bleat dogs circle clerks, scrawl figures that will soon be soaked, smeared, or lost entirely. Yet they persist, driven by something greater than pay or prestige, a stubborn belief that knowing the exact number of woolly creatures might help steady the empire itself. You pause by a stone trough, running your fingers along its cold rim. A lamb nudges close, big brown eyes, staring up at you with a question you cannot possibly answer. How many? Why count you sigh and offer a pat, knowing the lamb cares nothing for numbers, only for the next patch of sweet grass. As dusk creeps in again, the census men gather their papers, shivering as a fresh wind moves over the valley. You fall into step behind them, boots heavy with mud, wondering if tomorrow might finally bring them a simpler tally. But of course you suspect it never will. There will always be more sheep, more scribbled lists, more gentle chaos swirling through these green hills. And as the bells of the village call the day to a close, you feel the world softening into the familiar hush of a night among sheep. Night has drawn a soft velvet curtain over the valley, and you stir awake to the gentle hiss of a lantern being lit. The census crew has taken refuge in a tiny roadside inn, its low beams and smoke-darkened hearth offering a welcome haven from the drizzle outside. The common room glows with a peat fire, the air thick with the scent of roast onions and damp wool drying by the hearth. You settle by the window, watching the enumerators collapse into rough chairs, exhausted and ink-stained, comparing sore feet like a group of old soldiers. A kindly innkeeper brings mugs of weak ale and a pot of stew, so thick with barley it nearly stands on its own. The men gratefully tuck in their conversation, floating through the haze of steam. They talk about the day's mishaps, about gates breaking and dogs tripping them, about ledgers lost to the mud. Someone tries to calculate, for perhaps the 1,000th time, whether anyone in Parliament even reads these sheep numbers. Historians still argue whether the census results ever truly shaped policy or merely collected dust on a minister's shelf. One enumerator jokes about requesting a pay rise for livestock hazard duty, and laughter rings through the room, warm and tired. Another tells the others of a strange rumor. Supposedly, a farmer in Wales had trained his sheep to respond to whistles, with fake head counts, marching in patterns to confuse visiting officials. The table roars with disbelief, but then they go quiet, as though half wondering if it could really have happened. The shepherds, who share the inn's common room, eye the census men with a mix of curiosity and caution. Some sip tea in silence, boots steaming by the hearth, listening without comment. You sense a fierce protectiveness about them, as if these men of the hills would rather count their own sheep and answer to no one than ever trust a stranger's quill. One mainstream fact surfaces as you sip the warm malty ale in 19th century Britain. Wool from a single sheep could be spun into enough cloth to make a full suit, and every suit meant profit for mill owners and merchants alike. The empire's appetite for wool felt nearly endless, and these exhausted numbers on wrinkled paper somehow fed the beast. A fringed tidbit emerges, drifting through the lamplight with the scent of the stew. Some claimed certain flocks were blessed with magical wool that resisted rotting in damp cellars, fetching 10 times the price at market. Whether this was local folklore or slick marketing, no one can say, and historians still argue whether these miracle fleeces truly existed or were just sheepish tall tales. The night grows deeper, the inn falling into a hush as patrons drift upstairs to cramped sleeping lofts. You stay in the common room a bit longer, listening to the faint creak of the sign outside swinging in the wind. A dog by the hearth lets out a sleepy huff. Paws twitching in a dream of chasing sheep across the wide moors. The census men, one by one, nod off in their chairs, heads lolling like rag dolls, boots still muddy quills, still poking from pockets as though they might wake any moment to count more sheep. There is a tenderness to this moment, almost sweet grown men undone by the sheer gentle impossibility of their mission. You wonder if even the empire itself sometimes felt this small and drowsy, dozing beside a peat fire after a long day's ambition. Outside, a drizzle taps on the window panes, a lullaby for those who dare to listen. You close your eyes for a moment and let the sounds merge, the faint bleating of sheep somewhere beyond the hedgerows, the hiss of the fire, the soft shuffle of boots upstairs. It is a night for small comforts, for the steady presence of neighbors, and for the reassurance that dawn, no matter how messy, will always come. As the embers settle, you slip upstairs as well into a narrow cot under a low oak beam. The blanket is scratchy but warm, carrying the smell of centuries of wool. You lie there half dreaming, hearing distant bells mark midnight in a world still trying to tally every last bleat. In that moment you sense the quiet dignity of the census men and the sheep and the shepherds, each in their own way, clinging to order amid chaos, clinging to home, in a world far bigger than any ledger could hold. Morning returns in a hush, the inn's timbers creaking as you slip downstairs with the census men, ready for another long day of counting. The air smells of wood smoke and damp wool, a scent you're beginning to associate with this peculiar mission. Outside, the world is wrapped in a thin ground mist that turns sheep into ghostly shapes, drifting through the meadow like lost dreams. The census clerks gather their ledgers and check their quills with the grim focus of soldiers going back to the front. You can see the weariness in their faces, the way their shoulders sag at the thought of another day chasing numbers across the hills. Still, they set off with determined steps, boots scuffing the packed earth of the village lane. You fall in beside them, moving past cottages with crooked chimneys, their slate roofs shining faintly in the pale sunrise. Villagers watch from doorways, nodding politely, but holding back their true thoughts. There is still a quiet suspicion toward these officials, a sense that city men shouldn't meddle in rural affairs. Historians still argue whether the entire sheep census was designed to pave the way for tighter rural taxes, or if it was just bureaucratic curiosity running wild. At a hedgerow bend, the enumerators pause, confronted with a sprawling flock that seems to stretch from one end of the valley to the other. You stand for a moment struck by how beautiful it is, a living, shifting blanket of white under a soft blue sky. The dogs circle, weaving and snapping at the air, while the sheep push and sway like a rolling sea. It is breathtaking and utterly impossible to count. The clerks try anyway. One begins reading ear tag numbers, another scribbles, and a third holds, the inkwell steadying it against the wind. You watch as their voices rise and fall with practiced resignation, sometimes breaking into laughter, when a particularly clever lamb manages to slip right through the middle of the group. A local shepherd leans on his stick, amused, offering no help beyond a gentle grin. One mainstream fact echoes through your mind: the census had been ordered in part because Britain's industrial looms were demanding so much fleece that shortages were a constant threat. Knowing how many sheep roamed the hills meant knowing how safe the empire's cloth supply would be. Still seeing these animals milling around like slow, fluffy pinballs, you can't help but wonder if the numbers ever truly made sense. The clerks break for a quick snack, hard biscuits and cold tea seated on an overturned barrel near a dry stone wall. One jokes about needing a second census just to count how many times they'd lost count already. The others laugh, though their eyes look glazed as if numbers now haunt their dreams. You notice one young clerk twirling a piece of wool around his finger, perhaps comforted by its softness or maybe daydreaming about a desk job back in London. A fringe tidbit comes to you. There were rumors that census officials in more remote districts would sometimes just guess the numbers when herds grew too wild to catch. Local farmers like to feed these rumors, hinting that no one in the big city could ever really know how many sheep roamed their land. Historians still debate whether these wild estimates were widespread fraud or merely the best they could do in the chaos of open fields. The sun climbs higher, burning off the mist, revealing green pastures that seem endless. The bleats blend with the caw of distant rooks and the faint toll of a church bell that marks another hour slipping by. Time moves strangely here, stretching like warm molasses every moment, thick with the patient pulse of wool and weather. The census team stands to go again, stiff from sitting on cold stones. They pack away their biscuits and march forward, following a drover who claims he knows a better route through the gorse. You follow, too, weaving through the thorny bushes, brushing your sleeves against prickly branches, catching hints of lavender and wet moss. The sheep part reluctantly before you, their hooves, leaving soft prints in the clay. Halfway across the pasture, a new complication arrives. Twin lambs born only hours earlier, trailing after their mother with wobbly, uncertain legs. The clerks melt on the spot, cooing over the tiny lambs, even as they struggle to record their arrival. One enumerator carefully scratches a note in the margin about fresh entries, his writing barely legible through a mist of happy tears. Sometimes history can be adorable. By the time you reach the far fence line, the air feels warmer, the sun working its quiet magic on cold fingers and tired minds. The sheep slow their endless drifting, chewing peacefully bellies round with spring grass. The clerks stand in a cluster, staring at the landscape, perhaps realizing the impossible nature of their mission. And yet they carry on. You turn back toward the village, where a thin line of smoke marks the inn's chimney. The evening promises another stew, another drafty bunk, another round of stories about sheep who outsmarted even the cleverest quill. And as you walk, you find yourself comforted by the ritual of it all, the counting, the recounting, the grumbling, the laughter, the sheer everyday poetry of trying to measure the unmeasurable. You wake to the soft creak of a door as the census men slip into the morning light once more, ready to resume their woolly accounting. The inn's floorboards sigh as you step across them, boots still muddy from the day before, and follow the group into the fresh, chilly air. Beyond the hedgerows, the sheep are already beginning their breakfast mouthfuls of dew-damp grass, torn free with a lazy contentment. Today, the enumerators look determined, gripping their ledgers as though they might march straight into battle. A fresh shipment of quills arrived in the night, courtesy of a passing merchant, and you watch them distribute these precious tools as if handling swords before a great campaign. There is something so sweetly hopeless about it, the idea that fresh ink alone might finally let them conquer the unstoppable sheep. Out on the open moor, a shepherd waits, tapping his stick against a dry stone wall, a bit like a drum beat to keep time. He greets the clerks with a grin half charmed and half suspicious as they line up to count his flock. You catch snatches of their banter jokes about sheep who know arithmetic and about clerks who might as well just invent numbers since the animals refuse to stay put. Historians still argue whether these jokes were harmless or revealed a deeper resentment about city men meddling in rural ways. One mainstream fact echoes through the morning chatter wool production, alone accounted for nearly 10% of Britain's entire economic output. At the time, an astonishing figure when you consider how many empire uniforms, merchant coats, and fashionable gowns were born from these sheep. The census then was a way of protecting national pride as much as anything else, a patriotic tally dressed up as a simple livestock count. But the sheep, as usual, do not care for patriotism. They bolt at the sight of the inkpots, bunching together in a flurry of hooves and muffled bleats. You can practically hear the clerks' collective groan as they prepare for yet another impossible pursuit. One lamb even manages to leap straight through the open ledger pages, scattering them in a wild paper-fluttering explosion that leaves an enumerator slumped on a rock wiping ink from his nose. A fringe rumor comes to mind. There was talk of an inventor who tried to build a mechanical sheep, counter a kind of wooden gate that clicked as each animal passed. Supposedly, the prototype jammed so spectacularly that it counted the same 3 U's 100 times, then collapsed in a heap. Whether it ever truly existed, historians still argue, but the census men love to retell the story whenever morale runs low. By mid-morning, you crest a low hill with them, the world opening wide in every direction. Below, flocks move like soft, shifting fog over the green and gold of early summer. You breathe in the scent of trampled heather, a perfume of crushed stems and distant sea salt, blown up from the coast. The census clerks pause, marveling at the view, then sigh as they realize every one of those distant white dots must be counted somehow before dusk. The counting resumes. One clerk reads ear tags in a steady drone, a second scrawls, and a third tries to keep the wind from flipping pages. They slip into a rhythm almost musical, as if the whole exercise were a lullaby for the empire. 17, 18, 19. Where did 20 go? The dogs swirl in endless loops, eyes bright tails, high masters of the land even when the clerks can barely stand upright. You join the group on a brief rest near a battered milestone, its carved letters worn down by centuries of weather. There a drover recounts a local tale, one old ram so clever he learned to open gates, leading the entire flock on nighttime raids of vegetable gardens, slipping back before dawn to fool census counts. The enumerators shake their heads in disbelief, but you see a tiny flame of worry in their eyes because, truly, who could say such a thing was impossible? By afternoon, the sun is strong enough to dry the worst of the mud. A breeze lifts through the valley, carrying the smell of sweet grass and wild thyme. The clerks roll their sleeves up, revealing inky forearms and the occasional sheep-bite proof of their rugged adventures. They count on line after line crossing and recrossing totals until their heads nearly spin. As the day wanes, a hush settles over the hills. Even the sheep quiet bellies round and full, dozing under a golden light that feels almost holy. For a moment there is stillness, a calm that goes beyond numbers or empire, something ancient and true. You stand there breathing the peace, knowing that tomorrow will bring more confusion, more laughter, more hopeless head counts, but also more stories stitched into the wool of history itself. You watch the clerks pack away their ledgers, their faces half smiling, half defeated, but always ready for another try. They move back toward the village boots dragging through the sheep-tracked mud. The faint ring of a distant church bell calls them homeward, blending with the gentle lull of bleats fading in the dusk. As you trail after them, you feel your mind settling into the same calm rhythm, step after step, count after count, trusting that even the silliest of tallies can hold a certain quiet magic. And in the last glow of day, you swear you see a tiny lamb look back as if to say, "Better luck tomorrow." Dawn again, with the same chorus of distant bleats, rolling over the hedgerows like a sleepy hymn. You rouse yourself from the narrow cot at the inn joints, stiff from a night of half-dreams about wool and ink blots, and join the census men as they file out into the morning. Their faces look a little drawn, but their determination is strangely inspiring, each man gripping his ledger like a knight might clutch a battered shield. The air is bright and clean after a light rain, leaving droplets glittering across every blade of grass. You follow the group through narrow lanes bordered by hawthorn, where the occasional curious child peers out to watch the city men at their strange work. Here among the tangled hedges and tiny gardens, you can sense how close the villagers hold their sheep. They are more than mere livestock, practically woven into the families themselves. Historians still argue whether the census ever fully grasped that intimate rural bond, or if it only saw neat columns of profit. You catch up to a pair of clerks at a wooden stile, their boots dangling inches above a puddle as they debate how to count a flock that seems to have spread across 3 separate fields at once. Their frustration bubbles into sarcasm. One claims they should count legs and divide by 4, while the other insists they'd still miss half a dozen lambs that like to nap behind hay bales. You share their laughter, the joke ringing out across the empty morning like a blessing against the monotony. Down in the valley, you see market stalls being set up, their bright canvas tops snapping gently in the breeze. This is where the wool will go next, a place of weighing, haggling, and sorting, where merchants measure fleece by the stone and argue over pence. One mainstream fact slips into your mind: Britain's textile merchants bought thousands of tons of wool each year, then spun and wove them into cloth shipped from Liverpool, London, and Bristol to the farthest corners of empire. All of that began with sheep in these fields, nibbling their quiet breakfasts. The clerks push on, weaving through a maze of bracken, where sheep love to hide, vanishing in a heartbeat if a dog blinks. One of the dogs seems to share your sense of humor, pausing to look at the census men with an almost pitying gaze before darting back to corral a straying lamb. A fringed tidbit drifts to you. Some census takers carried bits of colored chalk to mark sheep that had already been counted, but villagers complained that rain washed away the marks, and a suspicious few even worried it poisoned the wool. Historians still debate if those fears had any basis at all. By midday, the sun grows warm enough to lift the scent of sheep dung mingled with crushed clover and a trace of something metallic from the tallyman's inkpots. You stand near a stone trough, watching the enumerators work through their ledgers like monks at a scriptorium, copying endless numbers with cramped, blotchy writing. It seems impossible they will ever finish, and yet somehow they keep going. Overhead, swallows wheel through the air, snatching up gnats, and a shepherd's whistle cuts across the calm, drawing the dogs back into their steady ballet. You follow the movement of the flock with your eyes, a shifting, swirling current of wool, each sheep an individual, yet somehow also part of a greater rolling tide. There's a kind of poetry in it that no ledger can truly capture. When the clerks break for lunch, they sit in the shade of a low stone wall, sharing bread so stale it nearly breaks a tooth. They talk about their homes, Families left in smoky cities, children who might not even remember them when they return. You sense a tug of homesickness in their voices, softened by the easy rhythm of sharing a meal among strangers who have become, in a way, comrades. One enumerator tells a story about how a farmer in Kent disguised his prize sheep with a smudge of soot so it wouldn't be singled out for taxes or special fees. Whether that was true or just tavern nonsense, no one quite knows, and historians still argue over such local tall tales today. But it makes them laugh a sound you welcome after the long hush of careful counting. By afternoon, the flock begins drifting toward the far hedges, bellies full, eyes half closing in contentment. The clerks scramble to catch their final numbers before the sheep vanish once again, as if the land itself conspires to hide them. Ink smudges, pages tear, dogs bark, and a lamb sneezes so violently it startles the whole pen, sending half the herd in a chaotic spin. You help gather up dropped papers, your hands coming away, stained with a delicate blend of sheepy lanolin and cheap Victorian ink. The census men, though exasperated, cannot seem to give up this count. Is their responsibility, their proof that order might exist even here where nature does everything it can to remain wild. As dusk slides over the valley, a hush settles once more. The sheep calm the men calm, and you feel a kind of relief settle into your bones. The quiet is almost sacred, a blessing for those who have spent the day wrestling with numbers no one will ever fully trust. And as the lanterns glow in cottage windows, you sense that tomorrow will bring the same challenge, but also the same gentle human hope that every bleat might one day be counted. You rise with the sun spilling golden light across the village roofs, the faint bleats already weaving through the air like a gentle chorus. The census men gather their ledgers again, eyes still rimmed with sleep, as though these sheep have invaded their dreams as well as their waking hours. You follow them out through a wooden gate, the latch squeaking just loud enough to set a nearby lamb into a startled bounce. Today feels different somehow, a new restlessness among the enumerators, a sense that the count is nearly done, but not quite finished. They move with extra-purpose quills at the ready, determined to pin down every last woolly wanderer before the next rains arrive. You join them across a wide field, where the grass trampled by days of counting is flattened like an old quilt. They begin the morning with brisk energy, reviewing figures from the previous day, checking them twice and even 3 times. One enumerator grumbles that sheep seem to multiply behind their backs like living arithmetic riddles determined to break their sanity. Another mutters that they do better to count shadows on a cloudy day. You can't help but smile at the honesty. Historians still argue whether the final published numbers were based on truth or a polite guess to satisfy the government. Past a half-crumbled stone wall, the next flock waits, scattered among wildflowers and brambles. You pause to admire them, soft, white dots moving gently through purple thistles and tiny yellow buttercups. The clerks, of course, have no time for poetry. They hunch over their ledgers, snapping their quills with quick, practiced motions, determined to capture each tag and mark before the sheep shift again. One mainstream fact rises from your thoughts. This census was meant not only for wool merchants, but to measure rural prosperity itself. Parliament wanted to see what wealth lived out here on 4 legs, what prosperity could be skimmed off for empire, and whether landowners were pulling their weight for the crown. It was a curious blend of economic strategy and national pride wrapped in an endless chorus of baa. The sheep, meanwhile, appear as indifferent as ever, nosing through tall grass for tender shoots, oblivious to empire and ledgers. You spot a lamb with a crooked ear, twitching gently as a bee circles its nose. A dog rounds up the slower animals with steady patience, as if reminding the world that at least someone in these fields knows what they're doing. A fringe tidbit floats to you from the shepherd's chatter. There was once talk of dyeing sheep bright orange to keep them from blending with rocks and heather, but no one could stomach the idea of orange wool. It became a village joke told for years after the census men packed up and went home. Historians still debate whether the suggestion was ever serious or simply a bit of local fun. By midday, the sun turns warm on your shoulders, bringing out the faint, oily smell of lanolin from the wool all around you. The enumerators pause for a bite of bread and onions, the air full of quiet, satisfied chomps. They talk about dreams of returning home to places where no one ever asks them to count sheep again, though you sense a flicker of fondness, too, as if they might miss this gentle country chaos after all. One clerk shares a story from a neighboring parish where a ram refused to move for 3 days straight, blocking the only counting route until bribed with a bucket of oats. Whether that was truly real or just an exhausted man's dream, no one challenges it. The details of this census seem more legend than fact already. Afternoon comes with a hush as clouds gather again, promising a new wave of drizzle by nightfall. The census men push to finish their lists, their ink-stained fingers trembling from the cold, their voices growing hoarse from calling out numbers across open pastures. You sense their determination balanced against the hopelessness of a world that will never fully stand still. As they wrap up the day, the final numbers come together in a rough column of ink dotted with smudges, fingerprints, and the occasional squashed insect. It is a work of clumsy art, fragile, but genuine like the men who made it. They check the sums, then tuck the pages deep into leather satchels, protecting them as if they held the secrets of the realm itself. The evening drifts in gently with a pink glow bleeding across the far hills, softening everything it touches. The sheep settle again, tired from their constant reshuffling, their breathing slow and steady like a lullaby. You stand in the hush, hearing the distant bells call villagers to their suppers, and feel a quiet pride humming through the group. Even if the count is imperfect, it is their count made with their own cold, tired human hands. And as you turn back toward the village boots, heavy with mud, you sense something precious, that even an empire can be measured in moments like this by the humble work of people trying with all their might to pin down the unpinnable. A pale dawn breaks the air, sharp enough to sting your cheeks as you step once again into the damp lanes with the census men. Their boots thud rhythmically, a tired but familiar beat after weeks of counting that feels endless. You sense a determination in them today, a kind of stubborn, final push to finish what they started, no matter how ridiculous the task seems. Beyond a crooked gate, the fields spread out like a rumpled green quilt, dotted with white lumps that shift and murmur. The sheep are there waiting, as if they somehow know it is their turn once more to stand in the columns of an empire's grand accounting. You trail behind the officials, the scent of peat smoke and crushed heather drifting on the breeze, and watch as they ready their quills, inkwells, and a battered biscuit tin for midday snacks. One enumerator remarks that he's lost track of which sheep he's seen 3, maybe 4 times already. Another, with ink smudged across his brow like war paint jokes, that they might start counting sheep in their dreams even after they return to London. You can't help but chuckle, the dark humor of it striking a chord. Historians still argue whether these worn-down clerks ever believed their final numbers were truly correct. The sheep, as usual, respond with absolute indifference. One particularly cheeky noses straight into a clerk's satchel, pulling out a heel of bread before the poor man can protest. The others laugh, and for a brief second the tension breaks the census, becoming more comedy than conquest. It reminds you gently that even the empire's ambitions can be undone by a determined animal with a taste for snacks. One mainstream fact floats back to you by the Victorian era. Wool was still so critical that a poor harvest of hay, which meant weak underfed sheep, could ripple straight through the textile trade, threatening entire factory towns. That fear gave the census urgency, even if the counting seemed absurd on the ground. You pause beside a hedgerow, letting your fingers trail along the scratchy twigs, feeling the tiny burrs catch your sleeve. On the other side, a pair of young shepherd boys herd a flock toward the census men, joking in thick accents that these ones can do sums if you like, sir. The enumerators sigh, fighting a smile, and ready their ledgers once again. A fringe tidbit tickles your memory. There were stories of farmers swapping flocks with their cousins just over the next hill, moving animals between parishes to confuse the counts and dodge any future wool tariffs. Whether that was ever truly widespread or just a countryman's tall tale, historians still debate to this day, searching for scraps of truth buried in forgotten parish letters. The counting resumes with a steady, relentless rhythm. One man reads ear tag numbers in a droning chant. Another tallies a third, double-checks the running total. They pause every so often to chase down a lamb determined to slip under a gate, ink pots, jostling dangerously with every sudden move. The dogs keep working tireless as ever, swirling around the sheep like shadows given shape. By midday, the air is warmed, carrying a soft sweetness from blossoming gorse bushes. The men rest on a low stone wall, gnawing their stale bread, while one tries to rub the soreness from his ink-stained fingers. Their talk drifts to distant family, to Sunday dinners missed to the dream of a bed without fleas. You can feel the homesickness in their words, made sharper by the vastness of these hills and the loneliness of so many bleats. One enumerator points out a ewe with mismatched ears. She's been counted 3 times. Mark my word, he sighs and the others agree with a resigned shrug. You sense that deep down, they know these numbers will never be perfect, and yet the work must be done. It is almost comforting in its strange futility. By afternoon, a light rain begins to patter down again, silvering every tuft of wool with delicate drops. The men shield their ledgers with their bodies hunched like monks, protecting precious scripture from the elements. You smell the wet lanolin on the breeze, earthy and sharp, mixed with the green tang of crushed grass. As evening edges closer, the flock calms bellies, full huddling in soft heaps against the coming chill. The enumerators close their ledgers with slow, reverent care, sliding them back into battered leather satchels. There is a small pride in their faces, tired though they are, as if they've achieved something grand or at least survived it. The village lights begin to glow in the dusk, tiny candles dancing behind wavy glass. You follow the group down a lane lined with primroses, their heads bowed under the gentle drizzle. A distant bell tolls the evening hour, mixing with a faint chorus of bleats, and you feel a quiet sense of completion in the air, even if the work is not truly over. In that soft, waning light, you realize the census was never just about numbers. It was about a nation, trying to hold the threads of empire together, stitch by stitch, sheep by sheep, even if those stitches were hopelessly uneven. And as you step inside the warm glow of the inn once more, boots heavy with mud and mind wrapped in gentle exhaustion, you know tomorrow will rise with new sheep, new jokes, and a new round of counting in a world that never quite stands still. The wind rattles the inn shutters through the night, carrying with it the hush of distant sheep calling to each other across the fields. You rise before dawn, the air inside still tinged with wood smoke and wet wool, and step out with the census men into another gray morning. Their faces carry that same tired resolve, as if they have been living the same day on repeat, forever chasing numbers that slip through their ink-stained fingers. Today there is a quiet determination among them. Perhaps the end is in sight, or perhaps they have simply given up trying to finish, and now do it for the ritual alone. You follow them across the cobbled street where the bakery already smells of yeast and flour toward a meadow glowing faintly with the first hints of sunlight. In the field, the sheep stand waiting, clustered like cotton tufts in a patchwork quilt, their soft breaths puffing into the chill air. The clerks approach with fresh pages bound into their ledgers, new quills sharpened to the tiniest point, prepared to tame this world one scratch at a time. One enumerator sighs, if only they stood still as nicely as bread dough. Another chuckles, wiping sleep from his eyes. You catch the village bell ringing faintly in the distance, calling folk to morning chores. The bleats mingle with its echoes, forming a curious sort of music, a lullaby for the empire's accountants. You sense a strange peace beneath it all, like the countryside itself has decided to go along with this census, for today at least. A mainstream fact circles in your mind by mid-Victorian times wool from these fields was shipped as far as China, Australia, and even India, linking the fates of distant peoples through nothing more than sheep and cloth. Standing among them, you feel the sheer reach of that trade, measured not in miles but in lives. A moment later, chaos erupts again. A dog nips too sharply, sending a dozen lambs scattering through a break in the stone wall. An enumerator lets out a quiet, defeated, "Oh, for heaven's sake," then dashes off, ledger flapping behind him like a tattered flag. You nearly trip laughing because, of course, the sheep would escape, right? After things seem calm. Historians still argue whether these repeated mishaps were deliberate sabotage or simply nature's rebellion against paperwork. After the dogs recover the lost lambs, the count resumes. You trail behind, hearing the rhythm of it all, ear tags read aloud, quills scratching numbers, a cough or sneeze every so often from the damp air. One clerk tries to recite poetry while counting, hoping it will help him stay awake. Another debates whether to record a lamb twice, since it never seems to stop running in circles. The shepherds lend a grudging hand, though their smiles suggest they still think the entire exercise is a giant joke. One gently teases an official about marking the same old U 5 times, and the census man only sighs, resigned to his fate. You sense a shared good humor in their mockery, a sort of friendly truce formed after days of tripping over the same clumps of sod and sharing the same weak ale at night. A fringe tidbit reaches you. Someone swore there had once been a sheep with a painted cross on its side, meant to signal already counted. But it wandered into another village and was mistaken for a religious sign, leading to a brief local legend of a miracle lamb. Historians still scratch their heads over that one, unsure if it was a rural prank or honest confusion. By midday, the mist lifts and sunlight cuts through in bright slashes, illuminating the tired but determined faces of the census men. They squint against the glare, but keep going line after line, page after page, as if willing the woolly tide into submission. You watch them bend close to their numbers, lips moving silently as they add up columns, trying to pin down a truth that keeps shifting. The bleats soften as the day wears on, the sheep growing calm, perhaps simply exhausted from their own evasion games. The dogs lie down, tongues lolling, happy with their efforts. For a moment it is quiet, so quiet you can hear a distant woodpecker hammering in the hedgerows. By afternoon, the enumerators settle near a stream, rinsing ink from their fingers and letting the cold water soothe their cramped hands. They talk about what they'll do once they're home again, how they might laugh about this someday, how they'll never look at a wool sweater without a faint sense of dread. And you believe them that one day the memory of this census will soften into something almost fond. As the shadows lengthen, they gather their ledgers, pages warped from damp, covered in crossings out and corrections, but still proudly held aloft. It is their mark on the empire, their strange legacy written in thousands upon thousands of sheep. The last rays of sun catch on the sheep's backs, turning them to glowing silver clouds against the green hills. You feel your heart ease in that soft light, reminded that even the most absurd acts of order, the most hopeless attempts to measure nature, can still leave behind a story worth telling. And as the census men turn toward the village, once again dogs at their heels and satchels bouncing against their coats, you follow them through the hush of evening, certain there is more to count tomorrow, and more dreams to weave from these gentle wandering flocks. The night passes with a chill breeze rattling the shutters, sheep calling faintly from distant folds, as if they too are counting something in their dreams. You wake to the familiar routine, the creak of boots on old floorboards, the faint smell of lamp oil, and the resigned shuffle of census men gathering their ledgers once again. Even you feel the rhythm in your bones now, sheep quills, mud repeat. Stepping out into the dawn, the village looks unchanged, but you notice the subtle signs of spring taking hold. Tiny green shoots along the hedgerows, birds darting among the thatch to build their nests. There is a sense of movement forward, even in this place where time can seem to stand still. You follow the group up a narrow lane past a row of cottages with smoke curling from their chimneys, and then out across the fields once more. The enumerators begin their work in a gentle hush. The sheep stand quietly this morning, their bellies heavy with fresh grass barely moving as the officials count. One clerk jokes that perhaps the sheep have grown bored of their own mischief, tired of running circles around these weary men. Another counters that the sheep are only resting to be more trouble later. You smile, sensing how they have come to know these animals in ways they could never have imagined. A mainstream fact drifts through your mind. Many Victorian landowners used the sheep census to boast about their prosperity, showing off vast flocks as living proof of their wealth and power. And yet out here in the damp grass, the sheep look less like trophies and more like old friends, soft, stubborn, and wonderfully unaware of their role in empire building. Then, like clockwork, mischief returns. A young ram breaks from the group, vaulting over a low wall and straight into a kitchen garden. The census men cry out in despair, chasing after it, while the shepherds double over laughing. Historians still argue whether these incidents were accidents or subtle protest from country folk who resented London's nose in their business. You watch as they recover the ram, coaxing it back with a handful of hay. The dogs help, gently nudging it along until it rejoins the flock. The men breathe out a sigh of relief, quills poised once more. There is something heroic in their persistence, a stubborn, good-natured refusal to give up even when the entire task seems impossible. The morning unfolds with a peaceful lull, the sheep shifting slowly from one tuft of grass to the next. The census men lean against a weathered fence, catching their breath, letting the soft breeze cool their faces. You can almost hear their thoughts that maybe they are nearing the end of their impossible journey. A fringe tidbit bubbles up in conversation. Some villagers claimed the census was really about finding out how many sheep could be taken to feed the Queen's personal kitchens, a rumor so outrageous that even the clerks laugh aloud. Still, historians argue whether that sort of suspicion revealed a genuine fear of government overreach or was simply a bit of local theater meant to spice up pup talk. By midday, the sun comes out, turning the wool on the sheep's backs to a shimmering sea of cream and gray. A few lambs lie down in the shade legs, folded neatly beneath them, their sides rising and falling with calm breaths. The enumerators take the chance to eat, sharing hunks of bread and a bit of dried apple, their conversation warm and almost hopeful. They speak of home of families waiting of beds that do not travel with them through mud and fog. One man tells a quiet story of a shepherd who refused to sell his oldest ewe, calling her a grandmother of the flock and treating her like kin. Whether true or not, you sense how deeply these animals have shaped lives, carrying not just wool, but entire stories on their backs. As the day wanes, a new breeze stirs through the hedgerows, carrying the distant sound of church bells, calling the villagers to evening prayer. The sheep begin to bunch together again, sensing the change as if they too follow their own sort of liturgy. The census men rise, stretch tired limbs, and resume their tally one last time for the day. Ink runs thin, pages wrinkle, and fingers tremble, but still they count. Each sheep, each moment locked in fragile paper lines. You walk beside them as the sun slips toward the hills, turning the world golden and soft. They pause on a ridge looking out over the valley, and you see the pride in their faces despite their exhaustion. This was no perfect census. In truth, it was probably riddled with errors and little jokes scribbled in margins, but it was theirs. A testament to a strange, determined effort to know the unknowable, to put a number on nature's calm, wild heart. And as they turn back toward the village lights, you feel the hush returning, that deep country hush that says it is time to rest, time to let the land breathe and let the people dream. Tomorrow will bring more sheep, more stories, but for tonight there is peace among the woolly ranks, and peace among the men who tried against all odds to count them. The sky is barely brightening when you rise, a thin, pearl-colored light, slipping over the quiet roofs of the village. The sheep are already awake, their steady bleats rolling out over the hedgerows like a morning hymn. You stretch boots, creaking, and follow the census men as they gather their ledgers for what might be their final round. Their faces carry the weight of weeks, but also a kind of gentle pride, as if they know they will remember this odd adventure for the rest of their days. Out across the meadows, the ground is soft with dew, and each step leaves a gentle print in the grass. The enumerators walk carefully, trying not to spook the sheep, who are calmer today than you've ever seen them. Perhaps they have made their peace with being counted, or perhaps they are simply too tired to resist. One clerk leans against a fence post, eyes half-lidded, and murmurs, "If I see one more lamb today, I might just take up chicken farming instead." The others laugh quietly so as not to disturb their woolly subjects. There is a hush to the air, a sense that even the land itself is ready for the final tally. A mainstream fact settles in your thoughts in the years after this census. Wool prices surged, and factories in Britain grew more powerful than ever, clothing soldiers and merchants and entire colonies. All of that spun out of this quiet, soggy, sheep-filled empire. You wonder if these census men understood how far their scribbles would reach. They begin the count again, voices, soft hands, steady. Ear tags are read out numbers, repeated a chorus of simple truths laid down on fading parchment. The dogs move gently, guiding stragglers, their tails wagging with an almost ceremonial calm. For once, even the lambs seem to cooperate, bunching together as if they too feel the work must come to a close. One fringe tidbit drifts to you from a passing shepherd. There were whispered claims that somewhere in the far north, a local priest had blessed the sheep for good health, and the census men counted them 3 times by mistake, because they never seemed to die. Whether legend or truth, historians still argue, charmed by the idea of near-immortal flocks hiding among the heather. The counting proceeds without panic today. The clerks work like clockwork eyes fixed on their ledgers, a soft murmur passing between them. You sense their pride growing with every line completed, not because they believe every number is perfect, but because they have done what seemed impossible. As noon comes, the sun breaks through in wide golden shafts, painting the sheep with a light that makes them glow like something holy. The census men pause, blinking at the sight, letting the warmth soak into their tired bones. You share their moment of wonder, feeling the quiet magic of a job, even a ridiculous one, done with care. They finish the final numbers with a slow, measured certainty, each total sealed with a careful signature, each page tucked away like a family heirloom. You see them breathe easier, shoulders dropping as if a great weight has finally lifted. By afternoon, they walk back toward the village, their boots heavy with mud and memory. One enumerator points out a lamb still chewing at a patch of thistles, and sighs that maybe they missed one after all. The others wave him off, laughing gently, unwilling to reopen their ledgers ever again. The sheep fade back into their flocks. Their numbers finally recorded their presence, woven into the empire's great ledger for better or worse. The dogs lie down at the shepherd's feet, tails twitching in dreams of tomorrow's works. And the census men, worn and smiling, know they will carry this tale home to their families, a tale of mud, of laughter, of sheep that refused to stand still, and of a countryside that revealed its heart, one bleat at a time. As they disappear through the village gates, lanterns begin to glow behind glass, and you feel the hush of evening settle around you. The empire, for all its ambition, seems small here, humbled by wool and weather and men who tried to measure the unmeasurable. You breathe it in the smell of grass, of sheep, of warm hearth smoke curling into the night, and know this moment will linger long after the ledgers are tucked away. The census in all its absurd brilliance has ended, and you are here a witness, remembering every step. The counting is done now, and you stand in the quiet glow of a village ready for rest, the last embers of daylight softening every corner of these ancient lanes. The sheep lie calm under the hedgerows, their breathing steady, their wool scented, faintly of grass and rain. There is no rush anymore, no scribbled ledgers or scolding dogs, only a hush that wraps itself around the countryside like a comforting blanket. You feel your own heart begin to slow, to match the gentle rhythm of a flock at peace. The census men at last have put their quills away, and their boots rest beside the hearth, drying in the familiar glow of peat fire. They have earned their sleep, every moment of it, just as you have earned yours. Let your breath ease, let your shoulders soften, as you listen for the faintest echoes of sheep drifting across the fields. Imagine each soft bleat as a lullaby carrying you into dreams, as tender as these hills, as steady as this land. There is nothing left to count tonight, no numbers to chase, no missing lambs to gather. The empire can rest, the fields can rest, and so can you. Feel the peace wash through you, a warm tide, a gentle hush that erases all worries. In this soft darkness, you are safe, carried by the same calm that steadies the flock. Drift now into a quiet sleep, and know that the stories of sheep, of people of impossible counts, will still be here whenever you wish to wander back again. Sleep well and sweet dreams.